Hi, this is the beginning of two lectures on applying theories to pastoral care and counseling or spirituality in counseling. And this article was originally written when I was in my doctoral program around 2000 with two of my master's students, Colleen Hanley and Maria Leventis, and it was published in Pastoral Psychology. It's a national journal on pastoral care and counseling, psychology, and spirituality. And then later we rewrote it and included it in a book on pastoral counseling, and now we're going to rewrite it again. These theories don't get old. But we can have new applications and new techniques and new thoughts on them. But now it's going to become a chapter in the book I'm doing on pastoral care and counseling. So the first thing it shows you is a little bit about spirituality and pastoral counseling, a little bit about ethics. We talked about that. Then it talks about the history of pastoral care and counseling in the United States. And the very first movement was two movements, the Emmanuel movement and the Clinical Pastoral Education movement, known as CPE. Both wanted to bring together the fields of medicine, psychology, religion. Elwood Worcester, he was a rector of Emmanuel Worcester Church, and several physicians in Boston established a clinic for spiritual healing. A lot of stuff going on in Boston around 1930. Probably 20 to 40, basically, 1920 to 1940, somewhere around there. That movement eventually ended around 1940, but on the other hand, CPE movement is continuing today. Most religious institutions require some form of clinical pastoral education. Most of that training is done in hospitals with hospital chaplains. However, one of the reasons why I'm putting together this book on pastoral care and counseling is when I was in seminary studying this, we had very few classes on it. And I did not feel prepared when I went out and worked with people in the community. So I think there needs to be more attention paid to this. And the CPE movement is excellent. It's great training, but I think there also needs to be classroom training as well as clinical pastoral education in places like hospitals and other service organizations. There is also the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education, ACPE, founded in 1925. It combines theological education and psychology. Let's see what else. 1963, first conference for pastoral counselors held in New York City. American Association of Pastoral Counselors, AAPC. And it maintains an active role today. If you do want an official certification, it takes an awful lot because you have to have basically extensive training in both counseling or psychology and some form of religion, spirituality, ministry, something like that. So it's almost like combining two complete degrees. It's very difficult for anybody to get that, and that's why we created this program, so that basically anybody who was interested in this topic could get a basic foundation and some useful skills that they could apply. It's a little bit about the history, and you can read more in the article. There are a lot of theories out there. We're just going to talk about the primary ones, but if you want to discuss ones that we don't discuss in the video in your discussion thread, that would be fantastic. So maybe we didn't mention something that you're very interested in, and you're like, oh, this would be a fantastic theory to apply to spiritual counseling. Well, tell us about it in the discussion thread. Tell us what we missed. Tell us what you think the pros and cons are. Tell us how you might change something, what you like, what you don't like. So in this video, we're going to talk about some of the classic theories like Freud, Jung, probably some behavioral, some CBT, maybe some REBT. And in the next video, we're going to cover the existential theories, including the branches. So different types of existentialism, person-centered, Gestalt, maybe narrative. Both lectures are in this document. I'm going to upload some supporting documents next week, but this has a basic outline of how these theories apply to spiritual counseling or pastoral care and counseling. You have a theories class in counselor education, so if you're in counselor education or a related field, you've probably learned the basic theories. So I am not going to get into lectures on teaching the theories themselves. What I'm going to talk more about is how they either apply to this specific focus or how they do not apply. And there's a couple interesting stories as well. So the oldest theory we're going to talk about is psychodynamic, and that's Freud. And I think he always struggled with his religious beliefs throughout his life. One of the interesting stories about Freud was that his primary caregiver was a nanny, and he spent most of his days with her, and she was Roman Catholic. However, Freud was raised in a Hasidic Jewish household, in a very strict family. So those two worlds did not make sense at his young age. The nanny would take him to church and tell him stories, probably biblical stories, and kind of teach him about Christian morality, things like that. And in the rest of his life, he was steeped in Hasidic Judaism, with all of the Jewish belief systems, the holidays, the community. And there was also, he was in Vienna and Austria and Germany, and there was a lot of prejudice and persecution of the Jewish people as well. So at some point, and we don't know exactly what happened, the nanny was dismissed. Some say she was accused of stealing something, some say she just left. We don't know exactly what happened, but it was abrupt, and Freud went through a sense of loss. And I think that the combination of the conflicting Jewish history and Roman Catholic history, as well as the unpredicted loss of his primary caregiver, caused a crisis in his life. And later, he didn't know how to deal with the anxiety that crisis caused. So he saw religion as a coping mechanism, but also a creator of neuroses and anxiety. So most people believe that Freud became an atheist. Some interesting things. Both Freud and his contemporaries talked about dream interpretation and human sexuality, and a lot of that was discussed in very early literature in Jewish mysticism, and the practice of Jewish mysticism is called Kabbalah. There was a lot of symbolism in people's dreams and in human sexuality. There's a lot of criticism about Freud, and I think that it's appropriate to a degree. A lot of the criticism is that he focused too much on human sexuality and didn't look at the other aspects of our existence and what makes us complete, holistic human beings. A lot of other people thought this as well. He worked with people like Jung and Adler and Erikson, and each one learned a lot from Freud, but they also said, hey, this is missing in your theory. Let's add this to it. And it would have been a very comprehensive theory if he would have accepted their suggestions. However, he didn't want anybody to disagree with him. They separated and formed their own theories. And we can see what happened through history. So yes, he did focus too much on human sexuality, not enough on other aspects of our being. He was primarily working with higher socioeconomic clients, usually young women from upper class society. He didn't have a well-rounded client base, not a well-rounded theory. He was chauvinistic, but that was kind of the time period. So it's easy to look back in time and criticize Freud. But we also have to understand that he was one of the very first people who even came up with the concept of a stage theory of psychology. He was one of the first ones to come up with defense mechanisms and interpretations and id, ego, superego. So just so much that he did contribute, and yet it's very easy to consider criticize a lot of what he did. So with that being said, let's look at what we can and cannot use, what we can take from Freud's theory. And professor of mine, Donald Capps, worked with Erikson and wrote a book on Freud. And he said that Freud has usually been understood to be an atheist, yet his point that most of us cannot imagine this providence except as an enormously exalted Father is important for two reasons. It suggests that religion, at least the religion of which Freud himself had experience, severely restricts our capacity to imagine providence, or the ultimate source of hope, as it limits us to a single image of God. It also suggests that to image God as an enormously exalted Father is to take the infant's rather than the adult's perspective of God, so that religion in effect never grows up. As Freud puts it, the whole thing is so patently infantile. And I think that was pretty interesting. So Freud saw both God and Satan as representing two divergent aspects of a primal father figure. And it's easy to see the limitations of such representations of spirituality. So, if we go with that understanding, our image of God, a higher being, spirituality, can't really grow. It becomes somewhat stagnant. So, a more dynamic aspect of spirituality is basically the ever-changing I am. An interactive, growing spirituality that is not constricted to male, female. It's beyond that. It's beyond that. So, Freud worked a lot with unconscious symbols, myth, metaphor, archetype. But I think spiritually, he was kind of stuck. So, I think he touched on some really interesting things when he talked about myth, metaphor, and archetype. And I think he touched upon some really neat things with his contribution of defense mechanisms in relation to the unconscious mind. If we become aware of those defense mechanisms, we can then act and change. When we're not aware, we're stuck. So we can use some of his contributions, even though his personal belief system and his view of religion was somewhat limited. So let's look at some of this. The first goal of treatment in Freudian psychology, or psychodynamic theory, is really to understand the role of the unconscious and human nature, self-awareness. And that's really the basis of all of our theories, is self-awareness. Self-awareness promotes growth. Self-awareness promotes both psychological growth and spiritual growth. It promotes change. Change usually results in some form of anxiety, but it also can result in growth. So, once a client achieves awareness of the situation and the self, the client can choose to either remain in that situation or to choose to change. So, I think that in one respect, Freud's focus on the past can be helpful, but we don't only want to focus on the past. We want to bring the past into the present. When we counsel individuals, we want to remain in the present. But we do have to deal with unfinished business. Freud kind of got stuck in the past. So, a lot of contemporary practitioners created their own theories, like I said, including Eric Barnes' theory of transactional analysis. And so Freud primarily dealt with psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory. The current psychological movement is more psychodynamic. So there's a more dynamic interaction between the therapist and the client, a little more than what happened in psychoanalysis. When you think of that picture of the therapist with his back towards the couch and the client on the couch, psychodynamic is more interactive, and that's a more contemporary aspect of Freudian theory. All right, so I think a theory that we don't talk a lot about in counseling is Carl Jung, and I know that Corey deleted Jung from his theories book, so uh, it's one of the more popular theories books. So let's talk a little bit about Carl Jung. One of the problems with Jungian theory is that it doesn't have a lot of steps. It's not as organized as a lot of theories. I know in Pittsburgh, they do have a lot of Jungian therapists, which I think is fascinating. He was born in Switzerland in 1875, only surviving son of a Reformed church pastor. Sister later born when he was 9 years old. Disenchanted with the experience of communion as a young boy, he spent much of his life in search of religious and spiritual answers. So he was a seeker. And I think one of the reasons why he was disenchanted is because he believed in the concept, the symbolic concept of communion. And he wanted that I-thou experience with the spiritual, with his higher power. So then he went searching, and he looked into psychology, religion, myth, the occult. He was a prolific writer. And he moved from a very traditional viewpoint of religion to a very spiritual viewpoint on religion, a more non-traditional viewpoint. He was a colleague of Freud's, but he moved away from Freud's theory in favor of an unconscious in two parts, personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, which is where we can tune into mass consciousness. He referred to experiences throughout human history as our collective unconscious. Each of us received these unconscious memories. So that's kind of interesting. Joseph Campbell picked up on a lot of Jungian theory. Joseph Campbell talked about social anthropology, and he really picked up on kind of the hero with 1,000 faces, myth, metaphors, and archetypes that repeat in every culture, even though those cultures don't have a connection with one another. We have these myths, and these myths teach us things about being human, but they recur in every culture. And if you're into English literature, Paul Ricoeur and Northrop Frye applied the concepts of Jung, myth, metaphor, and archetype to English literature, basically worldwide literature. And they saw these themes reoccurring in great literature. So one of the concepts is the mythic journey. And you can think about some powerful myths. And the interesting thing is that we're each on our own mythic journey. We are each seeking. We are each overcoming struggles, dealing with human pain and joy, dealing with the human condition, what it is to be an imperfect human, and overcoming so much. So myth, metaphor, and archetype are what I can really gain from Jung's theory. Jung viewed sexuality much more spiritually. He saw it as a symbol and a creative mystery unto itself. So I think that's kind of interesting. Here's a little explanation of what these terms are. So an archetypal image is like the portrait of an unknown man in a gallery. His name, his biography, his existence in general are unknown. We assume, nevertheless, that the picture portrays a once living subject, a man who was real. We find numberless images of God, but we can not produce the original. There's no doubt in my mind that there is an original behind our images, but it is inaccessible. We could not even be aware of the original, since its translation into psychic terms is necessary in order to make it perceptible at all. When people say that they believe in the existence of God, it has never impressed me in the least. Either I know a thing and then I don't need to believe it, or I believe it because I am not sure that I know it. I am well satisfied with the fact that I know experiences which I cannot avoid calling numinous or divine. It's just Jung's take on archetypal images recurring. So he really began to change the Western mindset. I'm going to scroll through the existential, the person-centered, and the Gestalt. We'll talk about that next week. So behavioral. We're making a big shift here. We're moving from some of the original theories in psychology, which dealt with unconsciousness, with sexuality, or myth, metaphor, archetype, to behavioral, which is dealing with only that which can be measured and observed. So here we have Watson, John Watson, the original behavioral theorist, along with Pavlov and a few others. And, his original experiment was the conditioned fear response of little Albert. He was frightened by a loud sound like cymbals when he was around a white rabbit or a white mouse, and this later generalized to white beards like Santa Claus and other white furry objects. And one of the problems was that little Albert moved away before he could become desensitized. So we don't know exactly what happened to little Albert. Another interesting thing is that there was a scandal. Watson had an affair with his assistant, and he was thrown out of academia. But interestingly, he went into advertising. And when we think about advertising, think about all of the things that advertising does to us. Think about how we are conditioned to want something. At some point I'll talk about my kind of theory of rationalized need, but usually we are conditioned to want something to fill a need. So, it might fulfill a basic need like hunger, clothing, other needs like safety, or it might contribute to partnership with somebody. So something might make us more attractive. Might create love and belonging and partnership with somebody. So a lot of the advertising focuses on meeting those basic needs. It convinces us that something that we want might fulfill a need. So for instance, when we think about automobiles, Volvo really played upon the human need, the Maslow hierarchy of need, for safety. And they had an entire advertising campaign. But if we look at other types of cars, they might play on human sexuality or wanting to attract somebody. If you drive a certain car. So all of this is kind of psychological manipulation. And it all began with Watson. Skinner moved beyond classical conditioning to operant conditioning. He wrote a book called Walden 2. Talked a lot about something that Bandura expanded on, and that was basically reinforcement and punishment. And remember, there's positive and negative punishment and positive and negative reinforcement. But the important thing to remember is that positive and negative isn't good or bad. It's plus or minus. So positive means giving. Negative means taking away. So when you're thinking about positive reinforcement, you're giving something that the client likes. Extra recess if they're behaved or do their homework. Negative reinforcement, you're taking away something they don't like, so they're still going to be happy. No homework. Positive and negative reinforcement are the best ways to use behavioral modification. Positive and negative punishment usually don't work in the long term. Spanking usually doesn't work. Only creates aggression, only works if people think they're going to be caught. Giving something that somebody doesn't like, extra time, extra homework, something like that, extra chores. So positive punishment is giving something that somebody doesn't like chores, or extra homework. Negative punishment is taking away something they do like. So people are unhappy with either type of punishment. There's a little quote there on Walden 2. But the biggest contribution for behaviorism really leads into how Bandura used it in his social learning theory and behavioral modification. Arnold Lazarus really did more with developmental theory, and he came up with basically his own theory, multimodal theory, and here he has heads the Behavioral Therapy Institute, and Bandura also worked with Bandura, combined classical and operant conditioning with observable learning, and included a lot of different theories and techniques in multimodal theory. So I think that one of the interesting things that occurred was he worked with Wolff and began to use stress inoculation, which helps people deal with anxiety. So stress inoculation is usually 3 types of relaxation. Physical relaxation, relaxing your muscles by tensing and releasing each muscle group 3 times. Breathing in through your nose, out through your mouth, which also creates a sense of mindfulness if you only think about your breathing using your 5 senses. What do you smell? What do you feel? What do you hear? All of those things. As you breathe, if your mind wanders, return your thoughts to breathing. And finally, imagery, some type of relaxing, guided imagery. Wolpe also worked with him on desensitization. So, few different types of desensitization. And we can think about flooding, which normally isn't used. Flooding really just exposes the client with the cause of a phobia or an anxiety. And then we could also have desensitization using mental images of the phobia. So if somebody's afraid of a spider, they would imagine a spider. And then they would have in vivo desensitization, which would be gradual exposure in real life to that phobia. So maybe there would be a spider in a cage across the room, and you'd look at that for a short period of time, and then you'd combine it with relaxation exercises. Eventually it would move closer and closer. So I think his work with Wolpe was pretty good. I think his work in multimodal therapy was appropriate. He came up with the basic idea to look at the holistic nature of his clients, all of the different parts to being a healthy human being. Cognitive and cognitive behavioral. William Glasser really came up with reality therapy and now his later book, Choice Theory. And I think reality therapy is very applicable to a lot of different issues. So he paralleled it with humanistic psychology. He maintained that problems were related to our basic needs, which he got from Maslow. And it echoes a little bit of the I-thou experience, because he always talks about, Glasser always talks about relationship. When we think about this, before discussing the basic needs themselves, we have to clarify the process through which they all are fulfilled. Briefly, we must be involved with other people. One, at the very minimum, but hopefully many more than one. At all times in our lives, we must have at least one person who cares about us and whom we care for ourselves. If we do not have this essential person, we will not be able to fulfill our basic needs. Although the person usually is in some direct relationship with us, as a mother is to a child or a teacher to a pupil, he need not be that close, as long as we have some strong feeling of his existence, and he, no matter how distant, has an equally strong feeling for our existence. Psychiatry must be concerned with two basic psychological needs: the need to love and be loved, and the need to feel that we are worthwhile to ourselves and to others. Helping patients fulfill these two needs is the basis of reality therapy. Just that conscious application to the I-thou experience really allows his theory to touch us on a human and spiritual level. So, even though it's based in cognitive behavioral therapy, reality therapy can move beyond that to touch upon the I-thou experience. He stresses the relationship between the client and the therapist. And my personal view of a relationship between a client and a therapist is not the medical model, which Freud based his relationship on, which would be that the therapist is the expert, that we diagnose, we prescribe a treatment, we carry that treatment out, and then the client is cured. Then we evaluate that. That's the medical model. I believe in the equality of the client and the therapist. We are equals in therapy. The client may have some personal expertise. They might have expertise in computer technology or plumbing or construction or childcare. It could be anything. And I might have more expertise in counseling. But as human beings, we are equal in that therapeutic relationship. And I am certain that I have learned and grown as much from my experience with the client as the client has learned and grown from their experience with me. I have become a better person and a better therapist because of my experience with my clients. So the relationship is very, very important. And I think his theory is very appropriate for pastoral counseling, when combined with an individual's own spiritual framework, their own belief system. Reality therapy or choice theory is really brief therapy, just like behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy. The next theorist I'd like to touch upon is Albert Ellis with REBT, and often referred to as the grandfather of cognitive behavioral therapy. He rebelled against psychoanalytic training, looked for something more effective. Very similar to Glasser in that he drew from many different theories, including Adler's individual psychology. All of CBT was originally used by Adler. He doesn't get a lot of credit for that, though. One of the interesting things that Ellis believed, humans are capable of both rational and irrational beliefs. Adler believed that as well. And the belief about an experience is more important for the individual than the actual reality of the phenomena. And he credits Greek philosophers for this. So men, he says men and women, are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. If two individuals are in a car and they both experience the same car accident, one might view it as a horrible event. The other might view it as a miracle that they weren't hurt. So, same accident, neither was hurt, yet viewed in a very different way. So a lot of things result from this belief system, whether it's rational or irrational. When people experience encounters or events, they interpret them. And many times they interpret them irrationally. And they become fixated on them in an unhealthy way. And this affects how they view themselves, and how they view others, and how they view future experiences or present experiences in life. So one of the things that's very important is for us to understand what the client's belief system is, what their viewpoint of life and experiences is, how they interpret their experiences, and if they maintain an irrational belief that inhibits them in a negative way to become a whole, healthy person. So, one of the really neat things that he came up with was ABCDEF. So, ABC is kind of what moves us into an irrational belief. DEF is how we address that irrational belief in therapy. So, this is also brief therapy, and I like to incorporate REBT in the ABCDEF method or technique. I like to incorporate it where appropriate. So, A, the activating event, something happens. B, the belief about that event, often an irrational belief. And C, the consequence. The consequence might be somebody carries an irrational belief with them. They are going to react to that belief in other encounters or in their view of self in a negative way. So they may have negative self-talk that would need to be addressed. And then DEF, we dispute the irrational belief. We talk about the irrational belief. And once we dispute that and they realize that it's an irrational belief, that has an effect on the person, and they make a change, and they might catch themselves with negative self-talk, and they might substitute positive self-talk as an example. And the result is a more positive feeling, F. So it's a very simple technique that we can employ if we find that our clients are holding some irrational belief, such as negative self-talk, that is inhibiting them from experiencing the present more fully, from living a more healthy and holistic life themselves. That is our lecture on Introduction to Theory in Pastoral Care. We're going to talk about the existential theories next time, and then after that, we're going to actually apply all of these theories in a realistic way to specific situations, to client-centered situations, to spirituality and spiritual concerns, and hopefully you'll find that helpful, rather than just this being a theories course, which I think you already understand, but applying these in a realistic way to different areas of spirituality. All right, thank you very much.